June 1941. The United States was not yet at war, but its military leaders were already terrified. Not of Hitler, not of the Japanese, but of something embarrassingly simple: how to get a soldier from a ship onto a hostile beach, and not immediately get him killed. The U.S. Navy had ships, big ones, battleships, cruisers, troop transports, but they had no way to deliver men from those ships to the shore quickly and safely. Every plan they ran simulated chaos. Soldiers bottlenecked at exits, struggling down rope ladders, jumping into water, drowning, getting mowed down before their boots hit the sand. The future of amphibious warfare depended on a piece of technology the Navy didn't have, and they knew it. As early as 1938, Marine commanders were filing desperate memos. There is currently no landing craft capable of transporting a full rifle squad to shore under enemy fire. So the military did what it always does: formed a committee, tasked a procurement office, issued requirements, sent out bids, and got junk in return. The early designs were slow, top-heavy, unstable in waves. They couldn't get close enough to the beach without grounding. Crews had to jump over the sides or use crude rope ramps, making them sitting ducks. One Army report summed it up: "We're building battleships to fight empires and sending our boys ashore in garbage." The problem wasn't new. The British had run into it at Gallipoli in World War I. The Japanese had solved it with their own flat-bottomed barges. But the U.S., full of factories, innovation, money, manpower, had nothing. By the time Pearl Harbor was attacked in 1941, the need became existential. America was now at war on two oceans. Amphibious landings weren't theoretical anymore. They were the only way forward. Generals begged for a solution. Factories submitted blueprints. Naval engineers ran calculations. And still, no breakthrough, until someone looked south, to a gruff, foul-mouthed boat builder in New Orleans, a man the Navy hated, a man they had tried to ignore, a man named Andrew Jackson Higgins. He wasn't a general. He wasn't even military. But his swamp boats would change the entire war. Higgins was a contradiction in every sense. He drank too much, cursed too often, bullied suppliers, and insulted inspectors. He hated bureaucracy, called Navy officials idiots in uniform, threatened to fire anyone who wore a necktie on his shop floor. But he could build boats, fast, simple, cheap, and they worked. Before the war, Higgins had made his fortune building shallow draft boats for Gulf Coast oilmen and loggers. Boats that could skim over swamps, bump over stumps, slide into marshes where no normal craft could survive. They weren't elegant, they weren't pretty, but they were indestructible. In 1938, when the U.S. Marine Corps put out feelers for possible landing craft, Higgins didn't wait for an invitation. He shipped one of his boats directly to the Marines, with a note: "Use it or don't. I know it works." They tested it, and it did. Higgins' boat, a modified Eureka model, could carry an entire rifle squad, skim across shallow water, and slide up onto a beach without capsizing. Only one thing was missing: a way to disembark quickly. Soldiers still had to jump over the sides. In training, that meant delays. In combat, that meant death. So Higgins went back to the shop. He borrowed an idea from the Japanese: a bow ramp, a metal door that dropped forward, letting soldiers charge straight out. The Navy hated it. It was ugly, unproven, foreign-inspired. But the Marines didn't care. They saw it work, again and again. Within months, the U.S. military was ordering hundreds, then thousands. They gave it a name: LCVP, Landing Craft, Vehicle, Personnel. The troops gave it a better one: the Higgins boat. What came next was a revolution in how America fought war. In North Africa, Higgins boats landed GIs under heavy fire. In Sicily, they delivered tanks and trucks onto rocky beaches. In the Pacific, they turned coral reefs into highways. And in June 1944, they made D-Day possible. But that's just the surface of the story. The real impact of the Higgins boat isn't in its metal or mechanics. It's in the man who forced it into existence: a civilian, a misfit, a madman, whose only loyalty was to getting the job done, no matter how many admirals he insulted along the way. By early 1942, Andrew Higgins had become both the military's best hope and its worst nightmare. His boats worked, that was undeniable, but Higgins himself was something else entirely. To Navy officials, he was chaos in human form, uncouth, vulgar, aggressive, uncontrollable. He didn't wear a uniform, he didn't salute anyone, and he didn't care what your rank was if you stood between him and getting the job done. He swore in meetings. He insulted admirals to their face. He threatened to sue military procurement officers when they delayed payments. He hated Washington, hated bureaucrats, hated the slow, risk-averse culture of naval acquisition. "They don't want boats," he once growled to a reporter. "They want paperwork. They want to run the war through file cabinets." And yet, despite every personality clash, every bureaucratic landmine, every attempt by entrenched interests to sideline him, the orders kept coming. Because no one else could build what Higgins could, and certainly not as fast. At his New Orleans factory, Higgins ran his operation like a battlefield commander. It was a brutal, relentless production floor. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. He hired everyone: welders, engineers, carpenters, janitors, retired fishermen, and teenagers. He didn't care about race or gender. Black workers, white workers, men, women, all got the same pay. Same expectations. Same screaming if they messed up. In a time when most Southern factories were segregated and slow, Higgins Industries was integrated, diversified, and faster than anything the Navy had ever seen. The secret wasn't just leadership, it was design. The LCVP, Landing Craft Vehicle, personnel, nicknamed the Higgins boat, was revolutionary in its simplicity. Built largely of plywood, it could carry 36 fully armed soldiers and drop them directly onto a beach via a retractable front ramp. The boat had a flat bottom, allowing it to beach in shallow water. It could turn 360 degrees in place. It could reverse itself off the sand without needing a tow. And if it broke, it was cheap enough to replace, simple enough to repair, and light enough to transport en masse. But there was still pushback. Some Navy traditionalists hated the idea of relying on civilian scrap wood. Others claimed the flat-bottom design wouldn't survive rough water. Some questioned whether plywood could take machine gun fire. But what they couldn't argue with were results. In combat trials, the LCVP outperformed every other design by a wide margin. It was faster to deploy, faster to recover, and safer for the men inside. In one demonstration, Higgins personally captained a boat through a series of obstacles, then challenged a Navy-built craft to match him. The Navy boat stalled. Higgins skimmed over debris and beached without pause. By the end of the trial, the Navy officer in charge turned to his staff and muttered, "God help us, he's right." Production exploded. From a small New Orleans operation, Higgins Industries ballooned into a wartime juggernaut. At its peak, the company employed over 20,000 workers and operated 7 factories. They produced not just LCVPs, but dozens of other military boats. PT boats, supply vessels, rescue craft, torpedo retrievers. But it was always the Higgins boat that mattered most. It became the workhorse of the Allied amphibious invasion force. It would soon become the tip of the spear at every major landing. Still, Higgins never changed. As orders piled up, he clashed with Navy officers over specifications. When inspectors suggested small changes to the ramp mechanism, he erupted, yelling, "You want to improve my boat? Try building your own damn war." He ignored dress codes. He mocked visiting officials. He even refused to attend certain award ceremonies, saying, "Medals don't keep soldiers alive. Boats do." But not everyone hated him. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who would soon become Supreme Allied Commander, saw past the temper and the rough edges. He saw the truth. Higgins was delivering. When asked years later who had done the most to win the war, Eisenhower didn't say Roosevelt or Patton or Churchill. He said flatly, "Andrew Higgins. If Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we never could have landed over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have changed." It wasn't just Normandy. Higgins boats were used in North Africa, Sicily, Salerno, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and every island-hopping campaign across the Pacific. In every theater of the war, if there was an amphibious landing, a Higgins boat was there. Roaring through surf, ramps slamming down, and riflemen pouring out into machine gun fire. These boats didn't win battles, but they delivered the men who did. They turned beaches into front lines. They turned the sea into an alleyway. And most importantly, they turned the impossible, a full-scale invasion across water, into something terrifyingly practical. By 1944, Higgins' factories were producing nearly 20,000 boats a year. His New Orleans workforce had become a model of wartime industrial efficiency. Everyone from Henry Ford to the Soviet military sent delegations to study how one man had transformed a local lumber operation into one of the most critical cogs in the Allied war machine. And yet, despite everything, Higgins remained the outsider. He wasn't celebrated in national newsreels. He didn't become a household name. His boats made the headlines, not him. And in a way, he liked it that way. But deep down, he knew what he'd done. He knew his ramp wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a door that swung open in thousands of battles for hundreds of thousands of men, and closed again behind them, leaving their fates on the beach. And that, more than any medal or newspaper column, was what mattered to him. On the morning of June 6, 1944, over 5,000 ships formed the largest amphibious invasion force in history. It was Operation Overlord, D-Day, and the entire outcome of the war in Europe depended on one question. Could the Allies get their soldiers from sea to shore under fire? The plan was brutally simple. Use heavy bombardment to soften German defenses, land infantry and armor on 5 separate beaches in Normandy, break the Atlantic Wall, and establish a foothold before Hitler could react. But for all the bombers in the sky, all the generals with stars on their collars, the operation hinged on something far less glorious. Small wooden boats carrying terrified young men straight into machine gun fire. The Higgins boats led the charge. At dawn, as the first rays of sunlight split the channel fog, the ramp doors of thousands of LCVPs dropped into the cold surf. Inside each boat were 36 soldiers, wet, seasick, shaking, clutching rifles, rosaries, letters from home. The engine roared, the coxswain shouted, and then the ramp fell. What happened next defined the bloodiest day in modern American military history. Men charged into chest-deep water, machine guns rattling from bunkers, mortar rounds falling from the cliffs. On Omaha Beach, the Higgins boats delivered wave after wave of troops into a meat grinder. Entire units were cut down before they reached dry land. Boats were shredded by shell fire. The surf turned red. And yet, they kept coming. One after another, the Higgins boats reversed off the beach, reloaded, and came back. Damaged, cracked, leaking, on fire, they didn't stop. Some pilots made as many as 6 trips through gunfire that day. Each boat was a lifeline, a 36-man lifeline, and they knew it. The flat-bottom design that bureaucrats had once mocked for lack of elegance proved to be a war winner. Unlike traditional craft, the Higgins boats could beach themselves, drop troops and vehicles, and pull back without tugs or cables. This kept the landing zones from choking with wreckage and gave commanders the ability to maintain momentum. Without that, the assault would have stalled within minutes. On Utah Beach, where the terrain was more favorable, Higgins boats landed troops with fewer casualties. Infantry poured through, followed by jeeps, supply crates, radio operators, medics. By late morning, the beachhead was secured. On Gold, Juno, and Sword, the British and Canadians relied on similar landing craft based on Higgins's designs. The entire Allied seaborne invasion doctrine had been built around the assumption that these boats would work. If they failed, the war failed, and they worked. By the end of D-Day, over 156,000 Allied troops had landed on French soil. Thousands of vehicles, tons of ammunition, crates of rations, and nearly every single one had touched a Higgins boat ramp before touching Europe. Eisenhower, watching the invasion unfold from a forward command post, reportedly turned to his staff and said, "That's Higgins's war right there, flat-bottomed and full of guts." But it wasn't just the beaches. The same boats were used to ferry wounded men back to the hospital ships. Bloodied, limping, half-conscious, they were carried by the same vessels that had brought them into the fire. The ramp dropped twice, once for battle, once for survival. There are countless photographs of D-Day, black and white shots of grim young men staring ahead as the ramp begins to fall. Helmets low, rifles clutched, eyes filled with fear and resolve. Those images have become iconic. But the boat they're standing in? That's the frame. That's the context. And that's Andrew Higgins. In many ways, D-Day was the moment his design became immortal. From that day forward, no one in the military could deny the role the Higgins boat had played. It wasn't just a piece of equipment. It was the platform on which the largest amphibious operation in human history had been launched. And yet, for Higgins himself, the success was bittersweet. He had seen the footage. He had heard the casualty reports. He had spoken to Marines and soldiers who lost entire platoons in the first 60 seconds after the ramp dropped. He knew what it meant to send men into a hailstorm of steel. He once said in an interview, years after the war, "I gave them a way to land. I couldn't give them a way to come home." That guilt never left him. For every general who praised his ingenuity, Higgins remembered the kids, and they were kids, who stepped off his boat and never came back. But he also understood the alternative. Without his boats, the Allies would have been stuck trying to storm fortified coastlines with old-fashioned launches and cargo nets. There would have been no D-Day, no breakout from Normandy, no liberation of Paris, no defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945. So he kept building. Even after D-Day, as the war pushed into Germany, Higgins' boats were used to cross rivers, ferry supplies, and breach ports. In the Pacific, they continued to deliver U.S. Marines to island after island, beach after beach, Saipan, Tinian, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. In each case, it was the same brutal dance. Approach under fire, drop the ramp, deliver the men, and pull away. Again, and again, and again. By the end of the war, over 23,000 LCVPs had been built. It was the single most produced naval vessel of World War II, and it had started in the mind of one irritable boat builder in Louisiana. In 1945, as Nazi Germany surrendered, Higgins received a formal letter from the War Department. It thanked him for his contribution to the Allied victory. He read it once. Then, according to his secretary, he muttered, "They could have thanked me with fewer damn delays on the steel deliveries." He didn't want medals. He wanted efficiency. He wanted results. And that, more than anything, is why his invention worked. By 1943, Higgins Industries had become the single most productive boat manufacturer in the world. Not in the country, in the world. And it wasn't because they had the fanciest tools or the best engineers. It was because Andrew Higgins had turned his New Orleans empire into a war machine that ignored every rule the government tried to impose on it. His facility wasn't just a factory. It was a controlled explosion. Multiple plants running day and night. Assembly lines that never stopped. Welding bays where sparks never stopped flying. Timber yards stacked with mountains of plywood. Forklifts racing across the floor. Workers punching time cards at midnight, walking out into the dawn. Higgins made sure the lights never went out, because the war never slept. The numbers were staggering. At the peak of production, his company employed over 25,000 people. They produced more than one boat per hour. When the Pentagon hesitated, Higgins didn't wait. He bought his own lumber, hired his own trains, forged his own supply chains. When steel shipments slowed, he threatened to sue the railroads. When government price caps squeezed his margins, he told the Navy, "Either pay for the boats or build your own damn war." He pushed people hard. His managers feared him. His competitors hated him. But his workers, many of them, respected him. Higgins paid better than most defense contractors. He promoted by merit, not race or background. His factories were among the first in the Deep South to openly integrate workers across racial lines. Black, white, Creole, Cajun, men, women, all worked side by side in a city that had never seen anything like it. When a government official from Washington came to tour the factory and suggested separate lunchrooms, Higgins threw him out. "We're not fighting Hitler with Jim Crow," he barked. It wasn't about virtue. It was about efficiency. Higgins knew war was numbers, and any system that wasted time or talent was a threat to victory. He wanted the best welders, the fastest riveters, the sharpest supervisors. He didn't care where they came from. He cared what they could do. His facilities trained thousands of women, many of them housewives or former domestic workers, in welding, riveting, painting, electrical assembly. Rosie the riveter had a Southern cousin, and her name was likely punched into a Higgins boat. But Higgins' success also made him enemies. The Navy never quite forgave him for being right. Procurement officers resented how he had bypassed them, embarrassed them, forced their hand by delivering results before they even approved the contracts. Washington officials despised his refusal to play by their rules. Senators tried to investigate him. Committees looked into labor disputes, tax filings, even alleged un-American behavior. They found nothing serious. But the message was clear. Higgins had made too much noise. Even the press began to turn. Articles shifted from celebrating the boats that saved the war to questioning the man behind them. Headlines wondered aloud if Higgins was too big, too aggressive, too independent. For a system built on conformity and control, Higgins was a threat, a reminder that sometimes one man moving fast could beat a whole army of pencil pushers. And Higgins knew it. He grew more paranoid as the war dragged on. He carried a gun. He started recording conversations in his office. He hired private investigators to look into journalists and competitors. He fought constantly with naval bureaucrats over specifications, costs, and logistics. But he never slowed down. He couldn't afford to. Because in his mind, every delay was another boy bleeding out on a beach. He saw the war not through strategy maps, but through the eyes of the 19-year-old stepping off his ramps. He thought in minutes, not months. Every production delay wasn't a budget issue. It was a death sentence. Every missed delivery wasn't paperwork. It was a rifle squad with no way to reach shore. That's why he screamed. That's why he cursed. That's why he tore through red tape like it was enemy wire. Higgins had no interest in being liked. He was there to win. By 1944, Higgins Industries was producing not just LCVPs, but dozens of other craft. The LCM, Landing Craft Mechanized, which carried tanks, the PT boats, which harassed Japanese convoys, and a range of support vessels, rescue craft, and maintenance platforms. His company had become a one-man navy. And the government, finally, had to admit it. They asked Higgins to open a second shipyard in Michigan. He refused. If the war's going to be won, he said, it'll be from the Mississippi River, not a snow-covered cornfield. He had turned New Orleans into an industrial fortress, and in doing so had proved something Washington didn't want to hear, that sometimes decentralized chaos outperforms centralized control, especially in war. But while Higgins won battles in factories, the war outside still raged. His boats were getting hammered in the Pacific. Photographs showed them burned out on beaches, half submerged, riddled with holes. Some were abandoned, others turned into bunkers or bridges. And yet, they endured. More importantly, the design endured. In remote forward bases, soldiers had begun modifying Higgins boats into all sorts of field contraptions. Makeshift gunboats, water ambulances, mobile kitchens, radio stations, supply shuttles. The basic design was so adaptable, so idiot-proof, that it became a Swiss Army knife for amphibious operations. One Marine officer wrote in a letter home, "Higgins made us a boat. We made it a way of life." For Higgins, that was better than any medal. When the war finally ended in 1945, the factories went quiet. The welders clocked out. The lathes slowed to a stop. And for the first time in years, the floodlights above Higgins Industries dimmed. Victory had come, in Europe, in the Pacific, across every beach where Higgins boats had slammed into the surf and spilled soldiers onto hostile sand. But for Andrew Higgins, it wasn't celebration that filled the silence. It was something closer to emptiness. Because the very thing he had spent the last 6 years fighting for, relentless production, maximum output, wartime necessity, was now vanishing in front of him. The government canceled contracts. The military, bloated with surplus boats, stopped returning his calls. Orders that had once come with urgency were now replaced with polite dismissal. There was no more war to win. And Higgins was no peacetime businessman. He tried to pivot. He proposed post-war civilian versions of his boats. He pitched leisure craft, fishing vessels, commercial ferries, even a line of family houseboats. But the world wasn't interested. The same government that had begged for his production miracles now had no place for him. His workforce shrank. His factories closed one by one. The headlines that once praised him as the man who won the war dried up. In a few short years, Higgins Industries was reduced to a shadow of its wartime glory. It wasn't just business, it was identity. Higgins hadn't just built boats, he'd built a purpose. He'd been the outsider who made the war winnable, the civilian who proved Washington wrong, the man who didn't wear a uniform but sent more soldiers to battle than any general alive. Now, without that war, who was he? He tried to stay involved in public affairs. He donated to veterans groups, sponsored civic projects in New Orleans, and even dabbled in politics. But the bureaucracy he once outpaced now ignored him. The Navy declined to name a ship after him. The Pentagon never gave him a permanent contract. Even as memorials were erected for the battles he helped make possible, his name was missing from the plaques. In 1952, at the age of 65, Andrew Higgins died in New Orleans. No grand parade, no national holiday, just a newspaper obituary that called him a wartime shipbuilder. But for the men who had stepped off his ramps, who had survived Omaha, Tarawa, Saipan, and dozens of other fire-soaked beaches, he was far more than that. He was the reason they had arrived at all. General Eisenhower, who owed much of D-Day's success to Higgins' design, once said bluntly, "He is the man who won the war for us." Not Roosevelt, not Patton, Higgins. Because in war, innovation isn't always about weapons. Sometimes it's about solving a logistical nightmare so completely, so irreversibly, that the enemy never even sees it happen. Higgins didn't build tanks. He didn't invent radar. He didn't crack codes. What he built was something older and simpler, a way to cross the water and not die doing it. A box with a ramp, a floating bridgehead, a plywood promise that said, "You'll get there. Now go." And that promise echoed far beyond the end of World War II. The Higgins boat didn't just shape the past, it shaped the future of military logistics and amphibious strategy. Its flat-bottomed hull, drop-down ramp, and rugged design became the blueprint for every landing craft that followed. Vietnam, Korea, the Falklands, even Iraq. Echoes of Higgins's invention can be seen in every boat that delivers troops from ship to shore. Today, a few surviving Higgins boats sit in museums, worn, dented, darkened by decades of salt and sunlight. Tourists take photos beside them. Historians point to the rusted hinges and explain their role in the liberation of Europe. But the real legacy doesn't sit behind velvet ropes. It's in the doctrine of armies. It's in the idea that mobility wins wars. It's in every sergeant who ever shouted, "Drop the ramp," and led his men into the unknown. Higgins' story is also a warning, a reminder that genius doesn't always come with charm, and that the best ideas are often born in the garages, swamps, and back rooms far from the centers of power. He wasn't polite. He wasn't diplomatic. He wasn't comfortable, but he delivered. When the government moved slow, he moved fast. When officers hesitated, he acted. When tradition failed, he improvised. And maybe that's why the system forgot him. Because systems don't like people who work without permission. They don't like the ones who rip up the manual and weld something better in its place. But in the moment when the world needed that exact kind of madness, it found it, in New Orleans, in plywood and steel, in a man who shouted down the Navy and made the most important boat of the century. So if you're looking for a symbol of American wartime ingenuity, don't point to the atom bomb. Don't point to the B-29. Point to the rectangle with a ramp. The Higgins boat. Simple, brutal, efficient, and utterly unstoppable. In the years following Higgins' death, America's memory of him faded fast. Victory had many fathers, but history tends to reward the ones in uniform, the ones with medals on their chests and speeches in the archives. Higgins had none of that. He wasn't a general, a senator, or a decorated officer. He was a civilian who barked orders in a factory, not a battlefield. And when the war ended, so did the spotlight. There were no statues, no schools named in his honor, no military bases bearing his name. Even in his hometown of New Orleans, the man who had employed over 25,000 people during the war slipped into the shadows of collective memory. That silence wasn't an accident. It was the natural consequence of how America treats its wartime entrepreneurs. During the conflict, they are essential. Afterward, they're inconvenient reminders of how much power the private sector can wield when urgency breaks the chains of bureaucracy. Higgins had bypassed procedures, challenged officers, insulted politicians, and questioned contracts. He had delivered results, but at the cost of obedience. And in peacetime, obedience returns to being the currency of favor. His company, once the crown jewel of the South's wartime industry, withered into obscurity. The sprawling factories that once roared with the clatter of saws and the hiss of welding torches stood silent. Weeds crept through cracks in the concrete. The docks where thousands of boats were launched into the Mississippi became ghost yards. For a brief time, there was talk of converting the facilities into commercial shipyards or industrial parks. Nothing stuck. Investors weren't interested. The war had been good for business, but peace was not. What made the silence more bitter was the contradiction. The U.S. military continued to study, adapt, and iterate on Higgins' designs. The fundamental idea of the landing craft, fast, flat-bottomed, ramp-equipped, became standard operating doctrine across the world. NATO navies copied the concept. American shipyards built newer versions with aluminum hulls and diesel engines, but the blueprint was the same. Higgins had pioneered a genre of warship, and even as his name vanished from the headlines, his influence remained stamped into the steel of every successor. Even his most iconic creation, the LCVP, found strange new afterlives. In South American navies, surplus Higgins boats were repainted and repurposed for river patrols. In the Philippines, they became fishing vessels and cargo haulers. In Vietnam, early advisors used them to move troops along narrow waterways. Some were bought by private citizens, converted into ferries or houseboats. A few ended up in scrapyards stripped for parts. Others simply sank, abandoned in muddy inlets, their ribs poking out of the water like forgotten bones. Meanwhile, Hollywood ignored him. War movies praised the Marines, the Rangers, the paratroopers, all of whom had relied on Higgins's craft to get to the fight. But the boats were just background, scenery. No one ever told the story of how those flat-bottomed beasts came to be. No one mentioned the madman from New Orleans who gave the Allies their legs. There were exceptions. A few military historians and naval buffs kept his name alive. Eisenhower's famous quote was occasionally recycled in books and documentaries. One biographer tried to pitch a film about Higgins's life in the 1970s. It never sold. Too industrial. Not glamorous enough. No love story. No battlefield heroics. Just blueprints, arguments, welding torches, and a guy yelling at bureaucrats in a southern drawl. For Higgins' family, the decline was personal. His children fought over the remains of his business empire. Lawsuits emerged. Property was sold off. What was once a household name in wartime New Orleans turned into a footnote. Even the few remaining Higgins boats were left unprotected for decades until preservationists and veterans groups began to recognize their historical value. It wasn't until the 1990s that a proper restoration effort began, led by a mix of war buffs, retired Marines, and shipbuilding enthusiasts. One boat, pulled from a riverbank and restored plank by plank, now sits on display at the National Wabituat Museum in New Orleans fittingly. It's battered, discolored, pitted with rust. But the ramp still drops. The steel still groans. And the silence inside the hull tells its own story. Not just of the men it carried, but of the man who built it and was forgotten. That's the American paradox. We remember the victories. We forget the tools. We praise the bravery of soldiers, but often ignore the minds that gave them a chance to survive. Higgins didn't hold a rifle, but without him, tens of thousands of men might never have made it ashore. His war was fought with lumber quotas and steel shipments, with design tolerances and deadlines, with furious telegrams and midnight welding shifts. And he won. Yet the textbooks rarely mention him. The museums give him a plaque, maybe a paragraph. In public consciousness, his legacy is a ghost, visible only to those who know where to look. But every time a ramp drops and boots hit the sand, his shadow is there. Because war isn't won just by bullets. It's won by logistics, by access, by moving men and machines across terrain no one thought passable. Andrew Higgins didn't change the course of history by chance. He did it with purpose, with obsession, with noise, and history, all too often, punishes the noisy. Andrew Higgins was not what you'd call a balanced man. He screamed, insulted, threatened, and demanded. He drank heavily. He fired people on the spot. His enemies called him a bully. His allies called him a necessary evil. And in the ecosystem of World War II, that kind of man was essential. Because when time was running out, when compromise meant casualties, when every bureaucratic delay cost real blood, polite didn't cut it. Higgins didn't ask for permission. He showed up with results. And in war, that made him dangerous in the best way. What fueled him wasn't patriotism or ideology, not in the traditional sense. He didn't give speeches about freedom or democracy. He didn't romanticize the war effort. What drove him was something darker, more combustible, a hunger to prove the world wrong, to show the East Coast elites that a Southern carpenter could outbuild the Navy, to shove success in the face of every officer who had mocked his ugly boats, to be the man nobody could ignore, not because they loved him, but because they needed him. That rage, that obsessive control, that refusal to yield, it's easy to dismiss it now as toxic. But in that window of history, it worked. America needed someone to ignore the rule book, to look at the impossible and say, "Give me plywood in 30 days." Higgins took every slight personally. Every delay was sabotage. Every critic was an enemy. And he burned through obstacles with the same energy that powered his assembly lines. If a shipment was late, he sent his own trucks. If a supplier failed, he built a factory. If someone said it can't be done, he did it just to prove them stupid. And that madness, it scaled. In just a few months, Higgins Industries went from a small boat shop to one of the most productive manufacturing forces in the country. He integrated his workforce decades before the Civil Rights Movement. He hired women, Black Americans, immigrants, anyone who could hold a tool and keep up. Not out of altruism, but because he couldn't afford to care about prejudice when the Nazis were racing to build rockets. He didn't care who you were, only whether you could weld a joint that wouldn't snap under gunfire. His factories were 24/7. His workers called it the machine. No holidays, no excuses. And yet morale was high, because they knew what they were building mattered. Every boat that rolled off the line was another hammer against fascism. Every ramp that dropped on some distant shore was a chapter in a larger story. A story of brute force and ugly craft that worked when nothing else did. And now that kind of energy feels alien. We live in a time of approvals, permits, HR protocols, and risk assessments. If Higgins were alive today, he wouldn't get past the first zoning meeting. He'd be banned from LinkedIn for unprofessional behavior. His company would be sued into oblivion by the third week. But back then, during the most global and brutal conflict in human history, he was the exact kind of monster we needed. His story is a case study in functional insanity. He wasn't trying to be admired. He was trying to win. He understood that comfort and greatness don't mix. That real innovation often requires breaking things, rules, traditions, expectations. He did all three. And in doing so, he changed warfare. The Higgins boat is a strange artifact. It's not elegant. It's not glamorous. There are no graceful lines or advanced weapons. It's a box, a blunt object. But that's the point. It's a perfect example of what happens when design meets urgency. When form is stripped to its rawest function, it doesn't look like it should change history. And yet it did. That's the real lesson. Sometimes the most important tools don't look like much. Sometimes the genius is in simplicity, in speed, in ignoring the people who say wait, in choosing plywood over perfection, saltwater over safety. Higgins knew that the enemy wasn't just across the ocean, it was inertia, and he beat it. Today, tech CEOs give TED Talks about disruption and innovation. But Higgins didn't talk disruption, he lived it, with a hangover, in a factory, at midnight, screaming at some colonel who wanted to reduce costs. And when that colonel's boss saw the results, the yelling stopped. Because results speak louder than reputations. Andrew Higgins never got the full credit. He was too loud, too rough, too Southern, too unfiltered. But maybe that's the price of actual contribution. Maybe history only has room for the polished ones in peacetime. But war remembers differently. War remembers who showed up, who built, who delivered. So next time someone tells you a problem is too big, too complex, too embedded in systems and politics, think about a man in New Orleans who ignored all of that, built a boat with a ramp, and changed the course of the largest war the world has ever seen. With plywood and attitude. That's the legacy of Andrew Higgins. Forgotten by the textbooks, etched into every wave that ever carried men into fire.